Hello, everybody, and welcome back after a slightly prolonged, much more prolonged than we intended break to the Ghoul Guides Association. We are, of course, the Ghoul Guides. I'm Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And today we are resuming our four-part witch series. We did not intend to take this long of a break. This originally was we were supposed to do this in December. It just didn't happen.
We were abducted by aliens. We then got sucked into an alternate dimension. We had a ghost problem that we needed to sort out. Somebody hexed us, and we just were unable to do anything. So whichever one of those sounds most believable to you, whichever one of those sounds most believable to you, that is what happened. And we can only apologize for our absence.
Honestly, it's been so long that any of the, if we actually told you why we were absent, it would just sound like fake excuses. So, might as well, say, we got sucked into a scam. We were in the witness protection. We were in spy school. We were girl bossing. Just pick something from your favorite true crime adjacent documentary. That's what we were doing.
And as Lauren said, if we talk, it's just been a series of unfortunate events. But okay, so witches.
Witches.
Yes, we will. When this episode is out, I will make a playlist. So if you are listening to this as part of that playlist, which should have at least 4 episodes in it, hopefully you'll be listening to this after the first 3 episodes.
In which case, pun intended, you'll be like, oh, did they take a break? If you listen to us when we usually drop once a fortnight, sorry about that.
Yes, but if you haven't and you need a refresher, please do go and listen to those episodes. We in this series so far have taken you through pre-Christian witchcraft and ancient Greece. Then we've talked about the European witch trials in the kind of medieval period. And our last episode, we were looking at American context and Salem. So today we are picking up where we left off. And we're moving into the 20th and then the 21st century to look at modern and postmodern contexts. So again, as part of this series, which we did plan, didn't execute very well in terms of timing and scheduling, but we did plan a chronological journey through European and I guess Western kind of witchcraft narratives and history.
And that's what we're good at, making plans and then failing to execute them on time.
But okay, so with that, with no more ado, shall we dive in?
Let's just dive straight in. We've talked about cat shit and worms. What a great prelude to talking about postmodern witchcraft.
Okay. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is known as the witch cult hypothesis. So Lauren, do you know what this is?
I could make an educated guess as somebody who is both a Gothicist and a fan of occultism and how should we phrase this? There's a term for it, nocturnal ritual fantasy. I can make an educated guess, but I actually have not heard that term as a term.
Okay,
I've heard those words, but not as a phrase.
So the witch cult hypothesis is so important to kind of talking about witchcraft as it exists or as it is perceived in the 20th and 21st century. And it's basically, this is the TLDR, it's the idea that the European witch trials, which again, you can go back to listen to episode 2 if you want a refresher on that, but the European witch trials were actually an attempt to suppress a pre-Christian or pagan religion. And it suggests that this religion actually focused on the worship of a horned fertility god And then this was considered to be, and it was perceived to be, satanic and devilish by Christian communities. So this theory argues that the individuals who were persecuted and tried for witchcraft, or in some cases, those individuals who were murdered for being witches, were in fact not innocent people who were caught up in a moral panic, but actually pagan practitioners or cultists. And things like the witches' Sabbath that involved nocturnal rites and rituals were performed in order to kind of worship this this pagan god. So it's essentially saying, you know, like, obviously we know that the witch trials happened, and it's positing another theory, right? So one theory is that these people were actually witches and they were worshipping the devil that exists in Christian ideas. Another theory, which most people agree with, is what actually happened, is that people, women, minorities, men, you know, people on the outsides of communities were persecuted for the perception that they were witches, but actually they were not witches. They were, you know, maybe midwives or people involved in those kinds of things. Or sometimes you would say, oh, my neighbour's a witch, or, you know, and you could use it for political purposes. But this theory posits that actually what was happening is that there were all these communities across Europe, and they were practicing this already established pre-Christian pagan religion. And that when Christians kind of discovered this, it was, you know, seen as a bad thing to be eradicated, and that's what the witch trials were.
So I have heard this.
Yeah.
I haven't heard it called that, but it sums it up really nicely. And this is one of those ideas that I have come to have a big issue with, I think.
Oh well, you and quite a number of people.
Because, and I mean, I'm sure you're going to talk about it, but this is something, I mean, if you're a fan of, if any of our viewers or listeners are a fan of kind of history and occultism on TikTok, this is something that people talk about a lot. And I think I messaged you the other day, didn't I, where I was saying, you know, there's this idea that because of the witch trials, we've lost a lot of knowledge, because a lot of the people that were persecuted during the witch trials were herbalists and healers and midwives, and, you know, there's a lot of evidence to say that soothsayers and seers were people who really understood the weather and that understood, you know, had almanacs and things like that. And they made predictions about things based not necessarily on science, but on knowledge. And things like, you know, old wives' tales. Don't put your shoes on the table, it's bad luck. It's not bad luck, but if you put your shoes on the table is going to get germy, you're going to get sick. And that there's a lot of correlation between superstition and things like that, and there's that idea that we lost a whole generation of knowledge, or more than a generation. We lost generations of knowledge, which I fully believe. Do I believe that we could have managed to eradicate the existence of an entire European-wide religion? Probably not. And I think that is a little bit troubling when it comes to, it's the same reason, and I don't want to step on your toes, but I have a massive beef with the "We Are the Daughters of the Witches You Could Not Burn."
Oh, okay, trend. Yeah. Let's put a pin in
so
that.
I'm going to stop there.
we are going to come back to that at the end. So this is actually, cool. You know, stick around to hear Lauren's beef with that, and also my beef with that. But yeah,
I just said that to prove that we don't talk about this before we record.
Yeah,
I'm just making sure everyone knows it's unscripted.
Sticking with the witch cult hypothesis for a little bit, and apologies because I know it is frustrating. But this idea originates in the 19th century with two German scholars, Karl Ernst Jark. Apologies for any mispronunciation, which I am, often do, and Franz Joseph Mohn. So it doesn't start in the 20th century, but it it kind of continued to be popular, maybe on the outskirts of history, but people were, giving it credence. And then when you get to the early 20th century, in steps someone called Margaret Murray. Who is Margaret Murray? So she was a British Egyptologist. And in 1921, she published a book called The Witch Cult in Western Europe. And then a decade later, so in 1931, she published another book called The God of the Witches. And then in the 20s, she was also asked to contribute to the Encyclopedia Britannica. So in the 1929 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, she was invited to write the entry on witchcraft. And this book, this text, then was, it was incredibly popular and widely circulated. And this text in this edition continued to be republished until 1969. So what was she saying in these texts? Well, essentially, she was using them to promote the witch cult hypothesis. So in all of these works, she basically argues that this pagan religion had supporters and followers all over Europe until the 17th century, and that it functioned as a rival to Christianity. She claimed that local covens would consist of 13 members. I don't know how she would know this information, but 13 members, 12 of which would be...
A ghost probably told her. If the Egyptologists and occultists are anything to go by in the 1920s, it was probably a ghost.
So 12 ordinary men and women would form this coven with another officer who, obviously is a devil. And they were required to hold weekly meetings. So you would have these weekly witch Sabbaths. And then they would also then meet for bigger kind of gatherings. And all of these, the smaller ones and the bigger ones, were presided over by a horned god. Christians perceive this as devil worship, but in actuality, Murray claims that this was just the worship of the ancient horned god with two faces, Janus or Dianus. So it is linking it back to, those kinds of Roman and Greek traditions, and melding that kind of older kind of mythos with also other European and British and Irish folklore. So she, for example, suggests a link between witchcraft and early indigenous European folklore, such as fairies. And this is a quote from The Witch Cult in Western Europe, where she writes, "There was a strong connection between witches and fairies. That there was a strong connection between witches and fairies had been known to all students of fairy lore. I suggest that the cult of the fairy, or primitive race, survived until less than 300 years ago, and that the people who practiced it were known as witches." So she's essentially, coalescing all of these traditions together and to meld into one kind of weird narrative where you have ancient Roman and Greek mythology and other kinds of folklore like fairies and, troll stuff and all of this kind of stuff just shoehorned into... It's just shoehorned into the witch trials, and it's like a melding of all of these things. So it is
troll stuff. No, so what you're saying is essentially it's taking all of those pre-Christian Western traditions, be they Slavic, be they Scandinavian, be they Britannic, be they Greco-Roman, and meshing them all together with a little peppering of Orientalism because it's the 1920s.
Of course, yeah.
And a little sprinkle.
just a sprinkle. And there's also an element of kind of secrecy here, because obviously for these kinds of groups and religions to have survived until the 17th century is what she claims, there has to have been some level of, the meetings being clandestine and people not talking about them and doing all of their kinds of ritual worship in secret, which also then, plays into those ideas of doing these cult rituals at nights, out of the way of mainstream society, and also perhaps the fact that, not only was this practiced by ordinary people, but there were also people in power who were participating in these as well. And you don't know how large it was. And that then what happened with the witch trials was the uncovering of this this kind of pagan tradition. And
Cult.
Yeah. And there is a suggestion that there is something sinister here. I don't think it's 100% suggested that, but there you can't get around that. It's you reading it through that kind of 1920s lens
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Last episode we talked about nocturnal ritual fantasy and where that comes from, and how it comes out of this social pressure where when times are hard, when things are difficult, there is a almost unconscious movement for people to use create the villain out of the outsider where there was no villain, but there is an outsider, so you can blame all the things on there. So in some ways it's kind of like a reclamation of the nocturnal ritual fantasy, and it's a reclamation. And obviously a lot of the Gothic tradition is that, it's the reclamation of the monster as a positive symbol rather than a symbol of vice and corruption and so on and so forth. But my problem with this is just like there's so many real victims of the witch trials, and I don't like the way that modern feminism, even from the late 19th century, and modern occultism has co-opted very real victims of something and used them to represent something that they didn't represent. And I think that kind of it not damages their victimhood, but they didn't do those things. No one should be, they shouldn't have been burned at the stake if they were a witch, but they probably weren't. And that makes it so much worse. And I feel like you mask the horror of what really happened. I would fucking love it if that was true. And I adore stories where it's actually the Fae were a primitive race, and this is why we love occult shit. There's no evidence. And that's just not how history works. I mean, if we know that some funky little guys in Austria had a cult and they were like, we're the Illuminati, we would absolutely know about this because people can't keep their fucking mouths shut.
Yeah, no, I mean, 100%, I agree with that. And I think that it's it's suggesting that oh, no, these people weren't witches. They were just pagan cultists. And it's it's weird. But anyway.
Yeah, it happens a lot, doesn't it? But it's phenomenal idea, appropriation and racism aside, that's another episode and one that we might be doing on Egyptology. But I fucking love the idea. Love it. Fantastic idea. Maybe not for the Encyclopedia Britannica, ostensibly a work of fact.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as the reason why I brought that up and how many editions it has is because it just shows how the kind of the popularity of this theory kind of continued and was sustained. Into the 20th century, this hypothesis was gaining steam and it was being spread around. We've kind of talked a little bit about your response to Murray's work, and we are going to come back to other people's responses. But before, I just want to ask you a quick question, because there was, in particular, one early 20th century author who was really inspired by Murray's theories. And I just wondered if you knew or could guess who that was. And I have a clue if you would like a clue.
Give me, is it male or female?
It's a man, and this author was very, very weird.
Do I like this person?
Probably not. But their work is very if you think like early 20th century, and this author was so pervasive in the works that they wrote.
Is it Lovecraft?
Yes, it is Lovecraft.
Oh my gosh!
Yes.
Okay, because my gut response was Crowley, and then when you said author, I was like, oh, it can't be Aleister Crowley.
So
H.P. Lovecraft. That
Murray's work are constantly cited in Lovecraft's letters and his research that he did, but also he puts them into his fiction. So often he'll, in both his letters and his works, he'll include a passage where he'll have a list of things that he's consulted, and among all these occultists and other kinds of historical works or pseudo-historical works, there will be Margaret Murray and her books on witches and cults. And I'll just give one example here. This is from one of his short stories, and it's called The Horror at Red Hook. And here he writes that his protagonist, quote, had not read in vain such treatises such as Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe, and knew that up to recent years there had certainly survived among peasants and furtive folk a frightful and clandestine system of assemblies and orgies descended from dark religions, antedating the Aryan world, and appearing in popular legends as black masses and witches' sabbaths. That these hellish vestiges of old Turanian Asiatic magic and fertility cults were even now wholly dead, he could not for a moment suppose, and he frequently wondered how much older and how much blacker than the very worst of the muttered tales some of them might really be. So I think when
H.P. Lovecraft passage he's ever written, I think.
I know, right? It's got everything there. It's got the racism, it's got the cults, it's some research and stuff. It's got it all. I think if you haven't considered the witch cult hypothesis in Murray's work when you've looked at Lovecraft, I think returning to his stuff and thinking about it, it's so clear to see how much he was influenced by her work and this idea. And the idea of cults, and specifically ancient cults that have been secretly existing for centuries and that are connected to older powers, perhaps dark powers, it's something that's really key to Lovecraft's work, right? And it's just so there with this witch cult hypothesis as well. Just the meshing of the two, and the way that it is inherently if it's not racist, it's definitely kind of her stuff, especially leading to that.
It's giving. It's very much giving, and I can't remember the actual name but the guy that wrote the text about Atlantis that the Nazis loved, which tells you everything. If you don't know about this, literally Google Atlantis Nazis and it will come up. But there's this pervasive idea throughout European culture that there were ancient superior civilizations like the lost city of Atlantis, and that Aryan people in particular are descended from those lost cities. And I guess that's the thing, the idea of there being secret cults, of being a primitive race of fae. When you start building into human history, occultism, and the idea of races, it automatically lends itself to eugenics and racism and all of these things. I think that's the reason why so many of these existential cults, things like the Urantia book, where it's there's a higher consciousness and there's aliens, and also eugenics. Why? Yeah. Why did you ruin it with racism? But I think that it just goes to show you that those threads of those mixings between the rise of spiritualism and the rise of things like the Golden Dawn and you know, all of these ideas in the early 20th century, like they all stem back to very similar roots, and a lot of them are about reconsidering some of the more unpleasant parts of history and trying to navigate a increasingly global society and multiracial society, often not for the better.
Yeah, and that is exactly why I included you mean, yeah, you might be thinking, why are we talking about Lovecraft? Like, this is an episode about witches. But I think that it is important to see just the reach of her influence and the importance of this specific theory. The witch cult hypothesis led to all of this other stuff, and it was really influential, but not necessarily in a good way. And yeah, so I'm not going to talk anymore about Lovecraft because, again, I want to get back to witches as well. But I think it is just really important to just see how witch narratives are so connected to other aspects of Gothic and horror, but also just our kind of political understanding and cultural understanding.
Yeah. And it really goes to show you, I know this is like going to be what we talk about in a minute, but like it really goes to show you how witch narratives in particular, like within the Gothic tradition, have been used to navigate. And I do, I do think Murray's theory is a clunky attempt at a reappropriation and maybe like a feminist rereading of history. And I love it when novels do that. Don't love it when people try and do it with history.
Yeah.
Because it's like you're trying to do something that reclaims something that needs to be reclaimed, such as a pushback against patriarchy and an acknowledgement of the loss of a matriarchal line of knowledge. But in doing that, you also do a lot of things that are very icky. But you can't, let's be honest, it's very white feminism.
Yes, which again we will get to near the end. But this brings us back again to Murray's theories, and what I want to talk now is the rejection of this witchcraft hypothesis. Lovecraft was convinced, but from the 1920s, when her first book was published, historians, folklorists, and witch trial specialists have been incredibly skeptical and unconvinced. Many of her contemporaries dismissed these theories as incorrect and based on poor scholarship, which I think is such a burn. It's like, it's not even like you're wrong, but like your working out is wrong. It's as a kind of academic, you know, fine, disagree with my ideas, but like at least say that like I've done good scholarship.
That is what I like to do. You know, like when you're, you know, so Mary and I both work in universities. You know, we're both academics, and one of my favorite ways to subtly shade somebody without actually being unprofessional is to be like, well, it's just not good. It's not best practice. It's not good scholarship.
Yeah. and why?
Academic speak for they're a dickhead.
And why was it not good scholarship? So basically, a lot of criticism of her work noted actually, because, you know, read her books and you'll see this, but they noted that she was highly selective in the evidence that she used. So, for example, she would use some facts to support her ideas, but then ignore like other facts and perhaps like bigger things that would, you know, discredit her stuff. So
is she the jazz age Naomi Wolf?
Do you know what? Yes, she is. And 100% like using pinpointing on a specific graph or a data set or you know, piece of thing to shoehorn it to support your theory and ignore just basically anything that discredits you or disproves your theory. You just pretend doesn't exist. She also was contradictory in her work. So in one chapter, she would use one piece of evidence to argue for something, and then in another chapter she would use that same thing to argue for the opposite. And then perhaps the worst thing, I think, when you're dealing with a kind of a period of history that is so violent and murderous, people were killed and people were harmed, is that she took a lot of confessions of people accused of being witches just at face value. So, a lot of these confessions were often made under really harsh, stressful periods, and often were under torture. And we know now that like anything that is confessed under torture, you have to just just dismiss. You can't include that. It's not valid evidence. But she would not even consider that.
Last time,
and she would
we?
just
Tituba was probably illiterate, so whatever she said, it didn't matter because she wouldn't have been able to say that that's what was written down. I think one of the trials we talked about, the person was tortured for like a year and a half before they made their confession. And I think we briefly talked about the Reykjavik incident, where they basically like tortured people so much that they started to think they had done these things. You can't, I know it's the 20s, but even in the 20s, you gotta know that somebody who's been basically waterboarded would probably say anything at that point. They're so desperate and so like just losing all sense of their self.
Yeah. And the threats and coercion, like, I don't want to stay in this prison cell, or please don't kill my mother, or don't kill me, or, all those kinds of things are also like things that are pressuring someone into saying something that actually might be untrue. So that is just some examples of why her work is considered bad scholarship. But by the 1960s and 70s, so I think it's important to think that like her peers were, doing the work and they were criticizing her work. But by the 1960s and the 1970s, her theories had essentially been thoroughly disproven. So the individuals persecuted and murdered as part of the witch trials were not witches, nor were they pagan cultists. It's kind of like just accepted now that these people were just innocent people who were caught up in a moral panic. And there is essentially a kind of historical and academic, at least, consensus on this. But despite this academic projection, Murray's work is still incredibly influential. And I think hopefully you will see that, like, even just moving away from the Lovecraft stuff, there are things that she has influenced. And you can see that in the way that witches and witchcraft are presented in popular media, in literature, that does kind of draw on some of the stuff that she popularized. And then also in terms of the practice of witchcraft that maybe it's different to what Lovecraft was doing, which is why Lovecraft was there on his own. We'll just put that to one side. But
it's interesting, isn't it? Because like, it's not, we talked about this in the very first episode. Witchcraft is the idea of a witch and witchcraft in Europe, and specifically to Western, is kind of a pre-Christian invention, a post-Christian invention, because it was part of faith, part of, the Greek idea that magic was a part of the life force, and that the manipulation of magic. And yes, there is a ancient Greek goddess of witchcraft, and you have figures like Hecate and Circe. But the idea of a witch in the way that we think of it now is very much a figure in contrast to the Christian religious tradition. But, we have like stories like, people thought that the wife of Edward, I don't remember which number he was, the Edward that was in the War of the Roses, that married an Elizabeth, who gave birth to an Elizabeth, who then became Elizabeth of York, who married Henry Tudor, who was Henry VI. There you go. I know enough numbers to know which one he was. That Edward, who was the brother of Richard II and supposedly drowned his brother, Duke of Clarence, in a vat of wine, but probably didn't. His wife because she was originally from the other side. She wasn't a Yorkist originally. I think she was Lancastrian. Her husband died. She was a widow. She already had 2 sons. They thought she was a witch. And things happened like the night they escaped from the tower, a massive fog rolled in. And there were all these things that kind of supported this idea that she was a witch. And a lot of the people kind of suggest that she leaned into that intentionally. And yes, we do know things like making puppets and, you know, putting something under your bed. Like there were things that were in women's tradition that kind of feed into witchcraft. But so there is this kind of like, oh, well, maybe people were witches and maybe they were, you know, doing these things. But it's a little bit like the Elizabeth Bathory thing, that when you look, or even like stories about Cleopatra, that when you look back, you realize it's probably men trying to, you know, discredit and disprove and, you know, all of these things, disempower women who were significant at periods of history. So I totally get why theories like this have such staying power, because they are not just tempting in terms of they're cool and they sound great. There is little pockets of history that could suggest, oh, well, if in the War of the Roses they're calling this queen a witch, then that suggests that witchcraft may have been a thing. And it's like making a puppet or putting a chestnut by your door or doing these things that were supposed to be good luck doesn't equal a systematic, organized like religion across an entire continent.
And this is where I'm going, is that what we see in the 20th century is the rise of neo-pagan witchcraft, which I think you can see how this religious spiritual movement is influenced by this kind of witch cult hypothesis, not in the ways that Lovecraft was, but in the ways that Murray makes connections with pagan and pre-Christian traditions. And I think that what is happening in the 20th century and what continues to happen is that these communities are, you know, sometimes it's a rejection of Christianity, sometimes it's just a rejection of patriarchal kind of structures and societies, but it is kind of looking to other ways, specifically feminist ways of being, and other ways that you can live your life. And if that means looking to those Roman and Greek or to other kinds of pre-Christian and pagan traditions, and maybe melding them into something that makes sense in the 20th century, that can be something that is empowering in a way that maybe what I'm saying is that Murray's theory is very problematic and it isn't, it's been discredited, but this idea of linking witchcraft in our kind of public consciousness in this modern and contemporary moment with pagan traditions has actually had like a kind of a good benefit. So what is neo-pagan witchcraft? It's basically like a umbrella term for neo-pagan traditions that include the practice of magic and witchcraft that kind of developed in the 20th century, and it's mainly kind of born in the mid 20th century. There were kind of like earlier kind of groups even in like the 1920s and the 1930s, but it is something that really kind of took fire in the mid 20th century. And the largest of these is Wicca. So some practitioners reject the term witchcraft, and some even don't like the term Wicca because of the negative connotations. Again, thank you, Murray, and thank you, like, men and patriarchy for, creating those negative connotations. But Wicca and other forms of witchcraft are very much not that. It's looking at ways to empower yourself and empower your community. So Wicca is what's known as a syncretic modern pagan religion, and that basically means that you're combining lots of different practices together. So Wicca draws upon ancient pagan practices but also modern motifs to form and inform its rituals and its kind of theological structure. So you have the return of older practices and things like Hecate and drawing on all these kinds of older narratives. But then you also have that kind of combined with more modern ideas. And, you know, especially as it's connected to the various waves of feminism, it's constantly updating and evolving and melding lots of different things. And there's so many, we can't talk about them all, but they're all interesting and diverse, and they have different kinds of interests and different practices and different ways of doing magic or practicing witchcraft. And some groups, thank you, Buffy, some groups just get together, because they want to have a kind of have the aesthetic, and they want to do a bake sale, but they're not interested in practicing magic and witchcraft, as Willow discovered when she went to university. But then some groups, there is a belief in the magic and the witchcraft. I think all of that is great. So Wicca was popularized in the 1950s and the early 1960s by a man called Gerald Gardner. And he was a retired British civil servant and an amateur anthropologist and historian. So he was like super interested in like pagan religions and esoteric societies and occultism. And this, like his kind of like interest and fascination with this kind of stuff led him to form what was known as the Bricket Wood Coven. And here he initiated lots of witches into his coven, and then they went on to found other covens. And he initially called this the witch cult. So again, I think you can see, like, thank you, Margaret Murray, for this idea. And then he would refer to his adherents as Wicca. But obviously, as you can, I'm assuming like Wicca has now just been adopted as the kind of term to describe this kind of movement. And based on the most recent survey by Pew, who do like a lot of surveys in America, there are an estimated 1.2 million pagans in the United States. And I think about at least 200,000. In 2000, there was another kind of survey, and there were about 200,000 people who identified as Wicca. So it isn't like, it's not on the scale of Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Hinduism, but it is still quite substantial. Yeah. And
it's approaching world religion status.
Yeah, definitely. And like, as I said, like there's lots of different strands. We don't have time to get into them all. But I do want to highlight that broadly, Wicca is very much aligned with feminism and green movements. And it's very spiritual, very introspective, but also about like the appreciation of nature and reconnecting with nature, isn't it? Yeah. 100%.
I think there's even like, there's Wiccan move. I know there's like some, I don't want to say covens because I don't think all Wiccans refer to themselves as covens, but there's some like groups, like, spiritual groups that come together to practice that like do, like old fashion, river gods and things like that. So they'll go and like, worship the river, but it's very much that kind of like, a lot of them are also conservationists by practice and trade and things like that. So it's that kind of bigger, I don't personally believe that there's a god in the River Trent. But if somebody asked me to go to something that was about appreciating the River Trent and the importance of the River Trent and the spiritual history of the River Trent and the sacredness of the River Trent, I would absolutely 100% go and be involved because, in the same way that I don't think a crystal has a specific energy, but I might still get it because it makes me feel, it's the psychosomatic, and there's been so much research done on this. But yeah, like I know that it's a very nature focused and conservationist and very green religion for the most part.
Yeah. And I mean, as we're here in the year 2024 and the world is almost constantly on fire. So I think, it's...
as I recently learned, researching my chapter for you, for your
yes,
eco-Gothic and religious horror, I did a chapter for Mary on Margaret Atwood and her post-apocalyptic series, dystopian series, Mad Adam series, and I was looking at like the religious orders in it, and I thought that petrobaptism was something that she had like made up based on maybe something small. No, realised American evangelism is massively tied into oil, gas, you know, they genuinely, and because a lot of them are end of the world cults, let's be honest.
Yeah.
Looking at you, Pentecostalism and Mormonism. But yeah, it turns out a lot of major Christian movements are also really fucking bad for the planet. So it kind of makes sense that if you're going to form a religion that is about feminism and equality, you're also going to be pushing back against climate change and pollution.
Yeah. And I think in a way, you know, it's separate, you know, Wicca and other forms of neo-pagan witchcraft, you know, they're not claiming necessarily that, you know, they're the same as the witches in the witch trials, but it is kind of still a kind of form of resistance or a response to and a reaction to forms of oppression, including patriarchy or capitalism, and, you know, both of which often engender policies and action that can be harmful to women, to people who are minorities, but also to the natural world. So it makes sense that there is this kind of allegiance between these movements, which actually moves quite nicely into what I want to talk about next, which is witchcraft as a form of protest. Which also actually developed in the 1960s. So yeah, whatever was happening in the 1960s, don't worry, I do know this, but whatever was happening in the 1960s, yay, because a lot of good stuff kind of came out of it. But yeah, so magic and witchcraft as a form of protest has existed for decades. And during the Vietnam War, there was a group who were known as the Youth International Party, or the Yippies, and they led a protest of 35,000 people who attempted to gather around the Pentagon in order to perform an exorcism. So it's very much this link between magical practices and protest, and a way that in doing this kind of public magical ritual, which is in and of itself, you know, if you say, I'm going to take some people to the Pentagon to do an exorcism to protest the Vietnam War, people are going to be like, an exorcism, okay, that's going to get more attention than, say, just a normal kind of like peaceful protest. I guess in the same way
it's powerful.
In the same way that, you know, going and throwing soup on a painting is also kind of different from a peaceful protest, but it's, you know, it's drawing on more of this kind of narrative of the occult. And similarly, like feminist groups also turned to these ideas. So there was another group called the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. And if you want the an acronym, that is WITCH. I know about this. Sure. Yeah. So they were formed in order to create allegiances between feminism and other left-wing causes. So it's very much coming out of this kind of socialist movement. And this group protested in what's been called like witty, flamboyant, and theatrical ways by carrying out witch-themed protests and political stunts. So one of their most famous ones that they did included a march down to Wall Street where they were all dressed as witches, and they went there and they went to hex the financial district. So yeah, again, if you have a group of people on a march, maybe that's notable depending if you get the numbers. But if you have a group of people, even if it's just 100 people all dressed as witches going down and then publicly hexing, you know, the financial district, that is going to get you more publicity. So I think there is this kind of counterbalance of, I'm sure some people do believe that the hexes are actually, you know, being performed. But also at the same time, even if there isn't that, it's still as a form of protest, I think incredibly effective. And I think in this kind of like witchcraft as protest, you get a melding of the two, which is just kind of really, really nice, I think, and a nice non-violent way to kind of, protest.
I mean, I personally, for example, think that things like manifesting are full of shit. You cannot manifest something. However, on the flip side, I also believe that thought and belief is incredibly powerful. And science 100%. Has proven this. If you believe in something really, really strongly, you have the power and the agency then to influence other people. Like, it does make things happen. Not necessarily in a divine way or in a, occult or mystical way, but it binds people together. It gives people resilience. It gives people determination. As I said earlier, I don't personally believe in witchcraft, but I, as an individual, use a lot of the practices that I've learned about because it's very meditative, it's very restorative, it's very empowering, and that means I get something from it that is spiritual in a way, and when that's applied to protest and when that's applied to learning and knowledge exchange, that's so incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Like, I think these are really, really effective ways to protest and to participate in activism. And a lot of people seem to agree with this idea because more recently, the rise of Trump has led to a resurgence of this kind of witchy protest, which doesn't mean that it hasn't been happening in the kind of intervening years, but that this moment in particular, the past decade, these protests have been catching more media attention, both in America but nationally. I mean, it's caught my attention, and I'm in Britain. Although I do have an obsession with American politics, so maybe I'm not good.
I was going to say, you are obsessed with American politics. You're not a good example. No. But it caught my attention.
Your attention.
And I'm just interested in cult stuff.
So in 2018, this is probably the most famous one. In 2018, a coven of witches gathered in a Brooklyn bookstore in order to hex the Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And I think there were several hexes that happened with him, some before he was confirmed and some after he was confirmed. And why the attention on Kavanaugh? Because he was accused of attempted rape and sexual misconduct, but yet was still appointed to the highest court in America anyway. So I think a lot of people found this, particularly as part of the Me Too movement, as just a kind of a slap in the face, really, I guess. And I think we are in a reactionary moment right now. But I think a lot of people found it difficult that, I mean, I don't know. I am obsessed with American politics, and I did watch quite a lot of the investigation that the Judiciary Committee did into Kavanaugh, and it was horrendous. It was awful. And even if you take aside what he's being accused of, his behavior in that hearing was so
terrible,
so unhinged. It's so unhinged.
Yeah.
He clearly has either memory loss or he's lying, but also he has a weird temper that seemed to come out, especially at women, that I think
absolutely
this person, I don't think they should be in any kind of position of power.
No. Regardless of what he'd been accused of, he proved himself to be such a terrible person, such a terrible politician, such a, unprofessional, horrendous human being, that it was like, on this alone, he shouldn't be in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Never mind the fact that he's probably done, all of these horrendous things. Yeah. And I guess it's no surprise that a lot of those protests were also accompanied by, or, you'd got people dressing up like the handmaids from The Handmaid's Tale, protesting the, hearings about Roe v. Wade. Like, you see this, coming together of feminist culture where you've got, people dressing up as handmaids, people dressing up as witches, people embracing all of these different things, that I guess just shows you how important witch imagery is in the cultural narrative, whether or not you are a witch or not.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, like I think it is powerful, whether it's being used to persecute, or whether it's a way, as you said, to reclaim the narrative and then to have it function instead as a way of resistance to that. And a lot of people that were involved in the protest, the organisers and the attendees, said that it was cathartic. So I think, it's also providing, I think, a narrative of now, especially, sisterhood and community, and also of a way of not just protesting, but also doing activism that can make a difference. So I think you had to pay like $10 to get into the bookstore, and the proceeds of the event went to women's charities and LGBTQ charities. And it's like, it's in the face of what seems like, a kind of unconquerable patriarchal system. These small things, I think, can be really useful, and it's hinging on this, this image of witches. Yeah.
But even that, I think you just hit the nail on the head there, because it's that thing as well of like, when things feel hopeless and you feel like your agency has been taken away, doing something like coming together and doing a ritual or a hex, or, coming together for a spring ritual or whatever it might be, it makes you feel like you're a little bit more in control. And obviously this is something, I'm not saying anything new here, religious scholars have said this for decades, but I think specifically in terms of the rise in popularity again in witchcraft in the last decade, it was really popular when we were kids in the 90s, and then it dipped, and then in the last 5 to 10 years it's massively boomed. And I think it's because we all feel so powerless. Yeah. But this is something that can connect people. It can connect people across, generations and countries, and can be quite unproblematic. There are some problematic elements to it.
Yeah.
But you are also able to reject those elements meaningfully. It's not like ignoring bits of a religious text, It's very much something that is still being shaped.
Yeah.
And I think that's why so many young women, so many LGBTQ people have been drawn to witchcraft in the last decade.
Yeah. And I think, that way of describing neo-paganism as a syncretic kind of movement, or, as a kind of patch quilt kind of construction, you can like pick the things that are meaningful to you and put significance and meaning into that, and use those in your everyday life or in these moments of protest. And yeah, obviously, just quickly, Kavanaugh obviously hasn't been the only person that's been hexed. Donald Trump has been hexed quite a few times. I think this group that organised this Kavanaugh protest also had hexed him in 2017 when he was sworn in. And more recently in 2021, a group of witches took to virtual spaces like TikTok and Instagram to cast spells against him in response to, the violent insurrection of January the 6th. So again, I think, especially moving into these online spaces, it can be a way of community and protest at the same time. One of the people who has been involved in this, so it's someone called Lindsay Melnick, who is a psychic, a witch, a tarot reader, and she's also known as the Florida Witch. But she said that the purpose of a hex is to send a lesson, not for vengeance. And overall, it can be used with good intentions. So I think, there's not...
I love that.
Yeah, I thought that, I read that and I thought it was really, it was really quite perfect. And the way that it's not about vengeance or malice, but it's about kind of trying to right the world in even in just a small way, or at least to acknowledge that wrong has been done.
Yeah, exactly. And like a lot of like witchcraft practice as well is like not necessarily about believing magic is real, but rediscovering the magic in the world and what can be magical, and then the experience of being magical when you've been a victim of systematic wrongs and things like that.
Yeah. So I would have loved to have ended it there actually, but I am bringing this to a conclusion, but I wanted to briefly mention two things as a kind of concluding points, as you know, as we look at the witchcraft in the 20th and 21st century, and especially thinking about where it's come from, thinking about where it is now. And there's two things that I have issues with personally. And I think you also share some of this, as we alluded to at the start. But the first one is the co-option of witch hunt language by those who are traditionally within the establishment. So what I'm talking about here is people like Donald Trump, who claim to be subjected to unfair and untrue witch hunts. So as recently as literally a few weeks ago, there's probably more recent ones, I don't know, but Donald Trump has denounced the civil fraud trial that he's involved in as an unconstitutional witch hunt. And he's also previously described it as the single greatest witch hunt of all time, which I think, given that there were, thousands of people that were murdered because they were accused of being witches, I think that's so... I mean, in the grand scheme of what he's done and what he said, it's not that important. But I think it is, important.
I think so, especially when you think about how much he benefits from the privilege of being, especially when you think about the context of America and how, like, European power disseminated during colonialism. The people who benefit now from patriarchal power are the people who asserted power through things like the witch trials.
Yeah.
The loss of women's health knowledge, the loss of acceptance about things like gender and sexuality, like a lot of that has come from, if you wanted to survive in the Western world, you had to be, a good law-abiding Christian citizen. And if you were a woman, you needed to be a good wife and daughter. And if you were other, then you better fucking hide it and go along with the status quo. And I think that's the thing that is so infuriating about when people like Trump say it, because it's like, you're a direct product of the people that led the witch trials. Like, you are a direct descendant, in both a figurative and a literal sense, in a way.
Yeah. And I think, like, Donald Trump is not alone in co-opting this kind of narrative. And I gave a presentation about witch hunts a few years ago, and I made a slide, and I kind of had taken images of all these different people who used it. And if anyone is interested in that, then let me know, and I will dig that out and I will share that specific slide. But there's so many people that use this now, often men, not exclusively men, but including Boris Johnson, who recently labelled his own Partygate investigation as a parliamentary witch hunt. People like Nigel Farage, and it's often men, it's not always men, but talking about what is essentially either just criticism or just general, like, an investigation or an inquiry or things like that, or people, protesting and stuff. Not everything is a witch hunt. And, it's, I think, let's not forget, it irritates me. Every time I see someone use that term witch hunt, because I've been noticing this for years, and I'm not the only one, but it is so annoying.
Well, the other thing as well is it's not just historical violence. There is still like mostly former British colonies, but also French and Belgian colonies, where witchcraft, like, people are still being beaten and like sometimes executed for witchcraft. Because a couple hundred years ago, Europeans went over it, gave them Christianity, gave them this very restrictive structure, and like there's still people in the world, unfortunately, that if you're born with a physical disability or as a twin, or again, even if you're just on the outside of civilization and community, you are still branded a witch, and that can be something that can be used to harm you.
Yes.
And used against you.
Yeah.
So it's not like witch hunts don't hurt people anymore. Like, it still happens.
Historically, and also, as you've said, it's a really great point. Like, even today, people are persecuted for being witches, and it's often people who are powerless and they are harmed by people in power. That is, essentially the narrative and the historical reality, as well as the contemporary reality of these kinds of witch trials and witch hunts. It's the powerful persecuting and going after those who don't have power, those who are minorities, those who are children, women, disabled, people on the margins of society. And it is just, it's beyond insulting to those people to use this narrative.
As someone like Boris Johnson.
But that actually then brings me on to my final beef, which is the whiteness and the cisness of some contemporary witch narratives. And I think I know I consume quite a lot of horror TV and horror films, and I think there is such a kind of a preponderance of whiteness associated with witches that isn't always there, and maybe when we get to our episode where we talk about other kind of witchy recommends and stuff, and that we'd want to recommend, and we can talk about Buffy, and we can talk about Sabrina and all those kinds of things, but we can also talk about other ones, like for example, one that I've just started watching, Domino Day, which is fabulous. But there is this kind of this move towards not just the kind of the media, like the kind of popular media that is focused on white witches, but also then in our kind of cultural understanding of witches and witchcraft and an association towards it, speaking to specifically white cultures. But then, and maybe I will let you talk about this, but the idea that we are the granddaughters of the witches you couldn't burn, and how this phrase has been used by the gender critical movement, and how it brings in transphobia. And again, if you think about the idea of the powerful persecuting against the powerless, and how much more powerless and persecuted can you get than the trans community, especially right now?
I have multiple issues with this, and what I will talk about it a bit more when we do a bit more. a bit more. But there was a really good BBC podcast, BBC Sounds podcast, called Witch or Witches. It's 7 parts, and they do a really good episode about this. But that phrase, you see it on t-shirts, sold on Etsy shops that are mass produced. And I think it really encapsulates the commodification and the materialization of something that actually historically, where it has been self-identified by often people who are outsiders and who are, if you identified as Wiccan, even in the 90s when we were growing up, people looked at you weird and you were, an oddbod, and, people wouldn't want to talk about it or express it at work because they didn't think it'd be taken seriously. Whereas if you rocked up with a rosary and you were like, oh, I'm really religious, that isn't, maybe more so now, but that wasn't going to affect your standing in a professional environment in the same way that saying that you were Wiccan were, for example. My issue with that phrase is that it is the full encapsulation of that sort of appropriation and aesthetic aspect of modern witchcraft that really grinds my gears, because if you are a white American or English woman of European descent, if you worship in ancestors, you probably worship in a bunch of racist colonizers. That's not something that we have in European culture, or at least in Western European culture. It is in others. I don't want to essentialize, but if you are, for me as an white English woman, if I was like, I'm really into Fae and I, respect the river spirits and I do all these things, that is entirely fine because that is my pre-Christian culture. That is my history. I am, entirely okay to do that. But then when you've got the appropriation of, African witchcraft and of Asian witchcraft and appropriating things, you see a lot of like, oh, well, I've also got a Krishna statue and I've also got, and it's like, no. Like, like the Orisha are their own thing. Like, that is not your culture. That is not your past. And I know it sounds like, yes, I'm saying this as a white scholar, like, it can come off, I'm aware how hypocritical this could sound, but I think because then you do see it on mass-produced Etsy t-shirts, and you see people, I watch a lot of TikTok, and you see people making, charging hundreds of pounds for crystals and for things that, the whole original purpose was that these were things you could find in nature, and these were things that you gave meaning, and there's people making money off of this and becoming like witchcraft influencers and things like that. And I have no problem with influencers as a general thing, but I think because then it also leads to, it was so easy to be co-opted by TERFs, and I think that is because it was such a like white feminism state in the first place, because those women weren't witches. The women and men and people that were victimized by the witch trials in the 14th to 17th centuries were mostly, almost certainly not witches. They were persecuted for something. And actually, if you think about it, if you're a Christian girl in like 1680 and you fully believe that you followed scripture and you followed your preacher and you are being tried for being a witch, that must have been fucking horrendous. Not only that your community has gone against you, not only, but because you believe that is your faith. So saying like, we're the granddaughters of the witches that you could not burn, these people aren't rebels. These people are victims. Like, this isn't it's not like having someone like Frida Kahlo and thinking, yeah, that's somebody who rejected the social norms and who embraced, because I still have a bit of a problem with that, but whatever. These were people who are victims, who did not think of themselves as witches, who, were persecuted for an identity that was forced onto them. You cannot, it's fine in fiction, like Juno Dawson's HMRC series, where she kind of like reimagines this idea that there is this secret society of witches. Fantastic. It tells a wonderful transpositive narrative, and it's a great idea. But in our actual everyday lives, so dismissive, so surface level. No wonder it gets co-opted by racists and TERFs. Like, do not buy a t-shirt for £15 from Etsy, mass produced in a slave labor like factory somewhere, shipped across the world. Like, the carbon footprint alone negates the message that you have on that t-shirt. And now I'll stop ranting, but that's my issue.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with everything. And I think that I think that there is an interesting way that witchcraft can be used, if we reclaim these narratives and reframe them as a way of resistance. But it has to be a resistance against systems of oppression. And for me personally, like, if your feminism is not inclusive, then it's not feminism. And like, if your feminism, like, don't get me wrong, I am a materialistic person. I love things. Things are great. Things make me happy. But like, if your feminism as well is based around buying into things, like, it's not earnest, because we're just perpetuating the patriarchy. As I recently had my mind blown about the evangelist oil thing, but it's like the Stanley Cup trend. We all started using reusable water bottles because it's more sustainable, and then the reusable cups and water bottles became a trend, and then people were buying, queuing up to get the latest one.
I have no issue with that in principle, but it's about how we then use those as symbols of ourselves. And if your symbol of yourself is by wearing a £500 crystal around your neck, think about how that figures within your broader feminism, because feminism and eco-criticism and civil rights, like, they're all ultimately the same thing. And I'm not saying that that makes me a good feminist, because I absolutely drink Diet Coke every day, and that is something that I should not do. So I fully acknowledge my own complicitness, because Jesus Christ, it's hard to live under capitalism. But I think it's the way that we present ourselves and the way that we use those things. Like, I think the appearance of it on t-shirts and jumpers is what really bothered me, because it's the way that you're signaling.
Tell, because you have mentioned the t-shirts
it really annoyed me. But like, it's the way you signal to other people what your beliefs are.
Yeah.
And if you're signaling that, sure, we all like to buy merchandise. I fucking love to buy merchandise. But I think, it's just indicative of that bigger issue where something becomes like a buzzword rather than like an earnest political statement. And I say that as somebody who goes, well, there's no ethical consumption for capitalism, every time I buy myself a little treat.
Yeah. But I think that's the thing. And I think this is maybe where we'll leave it, and that things are complicated and things are not ever, as simple as a binary, because things are complex and nuanced, but we can find meaning in a patchwork of things. And we can think about how things relate to us. Some people are really into politics and protests, and some people are more interested in, I guess, like, other things that are meaningful to them, such as their community and sisterhood, or having that kind of friendship and solidarity. But whatever way speaks to you, I think, we just, the important thing about witches that I hope has come through in all of the podcast episodes is that patriarchy is bad.
Patriarchy sucks.
Patriarchy sucks. And that, there is always this constant struggle against systems of oppression.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that's a really nice way to end it. And I think just to say again that, the Gothic is a wonderful way of exploring how those identities and those symbols have been used as symbols of oppression, but also symbols of resistance against oppression.
And I think it's
that's
also
why the Gothic's great.
It's a way of exploring difference. And sometimes, a lot of the times, even now, but throughout history, difference is seen as bad, as satanic, as witchy, as monstrous. But actually, difference is great. And it's so, I love the fact that everyone is so unique and different. And when, whenever we get together as a pair of Ghoul Guides or as a coven of Ghoul Guides, we each bring our
friendship
own
group the coven.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. And just to close, I'm sorry if you own one of those t-shirts. It's just my Instagram algorithm really thinks I want one, and they show it to me all the time. And the more I saw it, the more I got annoyed by it, because the more I thought about it. And then they talked about it on that podcast, and then I see people talking about it. And by the time we got here, I was so mad about it.
Yeah, maybe after this episode, Lauren's going to go and, I don't know, write some angry emails, some complaints. But on that note, we hope you've enjoyed this witchy series. And thank you for joining us, whether you've just listened to this episode or if you've listened to all four. Stay tuned for our Witchy Recommends episode, which will be coming soon. Hopefully not as long as this one has taken to get out.
Listen, we're trying to be fully back on our bullshit. We're aiming for back to our usual release schedule of every other Friday. We're both in a lot more stable a position than we were a few months ago, and hopefully good vibes only from this point on. So, let us know if there's we've got some episodes in the pan in terms of what we want to cook up. But as ever, if there is anything you want to hear from us, if you want us to talk about a specific Gothic adjacent pop culture topic, then you can leave us a comment on YouTube. You can leave us, you can answer the Q&A on Spotify. You can comment on our Instagram. You can find us on Blue Sky or the sinking ship that is Twitter. You can email us. You can send us a spirit guide, whatever it may be. We like to hear from you. But in the meantime, we will return to our books and our research and start putting together some new content. So stay safe and stay spooky, y'all.
Stay safe and stay spooky.